Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Wild Trout, Coldwater Fisheries and Management. My name is Martha Morgan. I'm the Water Programs Director at the Nashua River Watershed Association, and I'm one of the panelists this evening, along with Al Futterman, who's our Land Programs Director, and Wind Trainer Gwen Vold, who's our Communications Director. And we'll be, I'll be going over a few housekeeping items for tonight's program, and then Al will introduce our host. Our guest, our speaker. Tonight's program is being recorded, and it's a listen and view only mode. So we can't see you or hear you, but the chat function is actually turned off, or actually we can see the chat function. The panelists and the host can see the chat function. But if you want to ask questions, you can put them in the answer and question box at the bottom of your screen. And we'll answer some of the questions as we move along, but in the interest of time, we want to make sure we get through all the slides. We might hold some of the questions to the end. Alternatively, you could also raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can talk in real life. It's not like a regular Zoom, but this way we can have more people on the program than a regular Zoom meeting. So we can ask Dr. Kautza if he would answer some of the questions as he goes along. Just if you aren't familiar with us, the Nashua River Watershed Association is a member-supported organization, and if you're not already a member, we invite you to become one to support these types of programs. And you can visit us on the web at nashuariverwatershed.org. You may be hearing my cat in the background. She heard we're talking about fish, so she had to be here. Al, you want to take it away?
Yes, Adam is the Coldwater Fisheries Project Leader. He works all across the state with Mass Wildlife District staff and various outside partners on management, conservation, and restoration of Massachusetts coldwater fish resources. He has a BS in biology from the University of Wisconsin, an MS in Fisheries Science from the University of Idaho, and a PhD in Aquatic Ecology from the Ohio State University. We're very pleased that he can join us here tonight. All yours, Adam.
All right, let me just share my screen. There it is. You guys can see that?
Now we can.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me and thanks for the introduction. It's good to be here. I don't often give presentations to this sort of type of group. I'd like to more, but generally when I get asked to do presentations, it's a little bit more of a recreational type of organization, Trout Unlimited or something like that. So it's good to be able to branch out and do presentations for watershed associations and things like that. So I've tweaked my presentation template that I usually give a little bit to sort of make it more relevant to the Nashua River watershed. So hopefully you find this information interesting and useful in some ways. And again, if you have questions while we go along, I can answer them. Or just wait until the end, and then I'll have my contact information at the end too. If you want to chat, afterwards, or send me an email if you have questions down the line or want to talk about anything sort of wild trout related, feel free to reach out. All right, so today I'm going to talk about just this general outline of what I'm going to be talking about. So give you an overview of the current state of knowledge that we have regarding our wild trout resources here in Massachusetts. So their status, their distribution across the state. I'll talk a bit about our wild trout stream classification system that we've developed as a way to manage these fisheries. And then I'll touch on climate change impacts to coldwater fisheries. But again, climate change and its impacts on coldwater fisheries is such a huge topic. And it can get very in depth. So I'll just touch on it a little bit. I won't go into too much detail. So if you guys, again, if you have questions about this or want to talk about it afterwards, that's totally fine with me. And then I'll end with a few slides more pertinent to the Nashua River watershed talking about some of your wild trout resources and some of the issues that they face, which really aren't that much different than the issues that wild trout and cold water systems face really anywhere, anywhere they exist. So, but we'll talk about that towards the end. All right, so this is a map of Massachusetts. Obviously, you'll see everything in black is a stream that we have records of wild trout in. So wild trout are not, confined to one certain area. They certainly are widespread. In some cases, quite abundant where they're found. They're everywhere from Martha's Vineyard, Cape Cod, the greater Boston metro area. And then we start getting into your area and west. It's almost harder to find a stream without trout than it is to find a stream with trout. So, they are abundant and they are widespread. Currently, we have records in our fisheries database of 1,277 streams that support naturally reproducing populations of wild trout. We haven't put everything in from this past year's survey yet, so there's likely to be a few more. We pick up a few each year that we've never surveyed before or something like that. So this number is probably a little bit higher. It might be next time I go through the database, it probably will add a few. Most of these wild trout streams are populated by wild brook trout, and I'll talk about each of our sort of major wild trout species in much more detail in the next few slides, but I'll just sort of lay out the big picture right here. We have a fair number of wild brown trout streams, just a small handful of wild rainbow trout streams in Massachusetts. And we have about 132 streams with no current evidence of wild trout. So what this means is these are streams that are highlighted in black that at one point in the past, whether it was in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, even earlier on this century, early 2000s, we had survey data saying that there were wild trout in that stream. But since we've resurveyed these systems in the last 5-10 years or so, we've been unable to locate any wild trout. Whether that means they're extirpated or whether that means that they've dropped down in abundance to the level where we no longer are able to find them in the usual spots, both of these outcomes are concerning. So the fact that 132 streams that used to have wild trout no longer have abundances to the point where we just can't necessarily find them. It's a concerning development, and it's likely to continue in some parts of the state, particularly, in the eastern part of the state or areas that are, undergoing, development or population growth and things like that. But, hopefully we can talk about some of the things that we can do to kind of stem that tide a little bit. And then there's a small number of streams that have this historic data where there were wild trout there at some point, but we haven't gotten back to survey those just yet. So we're still unknown on some of these, but there's just a small number of those. All right, so we'll start with a few more details on brook trout. Far and away the most abundant and the most widely distributed of our wild trout species here in Massachusetts are brook trout. They're also the only native trout to Massachusetts. You'll find them just about anywhere in the state that you find wild trout. Generally, wild brook trout fisheries are populated by, short-lived individuals, generally fully mature, by 2 years old and live to maybe 3 years old. Occasionally we see a 4-year-old fish, but it's pretty rare. And then, these 2 and 3-year-old fish top out about 5 to 7 inches. We do occasionally see brook trout over 8 inches, sometimes even 9 inches or 10 inches, but it's pretty rare. There are a few unique places like the Swift River tailwater, our sea-run brook trout streams, and a few streams here and there across the state where we find larger individuals. And in the case of the Swift River and the sea-run streams, sometimes substantially larger individuals. But for the most part, short-lived, generally small, and that's really advantageous for the types of habitats they live in. Like evolutionarily, living 2 or 3 years old, for 2 or 3 years, reproducing a couple of times and passing on is probably a better strategy in the streams that these guys live in, because they do experience some very wide fluctuations in conditions, whether it's drought or floods or freezing or what have you. If you wait and delay maturation and get bigger and bigger before you finally reproduce, you may find that you've run into some conditions that cause mortality and you never ended up getting to reproduce. So short-lived and small fish in the streams that we have in most of the brook trout's range is conducive to being short-lived and small. So that's generally why we have those types of populations. Also, as I mentioned, we have a fair number of wild brown trout streams in Massachusetts. Brown trout are not native to North America. They were brought over to Massachusetts sometime in the late 1800s. It's hard to pinpoint a date, but they came from Western Europe, and they were brought over to sort of stock into rivers and streams to prop up a declining coldwater fishery. So it's kind of crazy to think about that 150 years ago, we were experiencing declines in abundance of coldwater fishes to the point where we had to introduce species to sort of prop up that fishery. So they've since been stocked, across the state in a number of water bodies, and they've become established in about 140 streams currently. So most of these streams are tributaries to the Connecticut River, the Deerfield River system, and then a number of streams in the Hoosick and the Housatonic River basins. So mostly out west. They're not nearly as widespread as the native brook trout, and they're not really as abundant either where they are found. Generally, for the most part, our wild brown trout fisheries look similar to what we see for our wild brook trout fisheries, short-lived, generally small, although brown trout on average, according to our records, are slightly larger. And we do see a much higher proportion of them kind of in this 10-inch plus class. Part of that is because, they tend to thrive a lot more in sort of our larger coldwater systems, like the Deerfield, like the Hoosick, some of the larger tributaries out west. And so they have, the conditions to live longer, grow much larger, and look a little bit different than what we see in the vast majority of our, sort of small stream fisheries. And so, places like the Deerfield River and the Hoosick River, we see much older brown trout than we would otherwise. They sometimes 8+ years old. And then, these fish can be, 2 feet in length or more. So a little bit different than we see in our small streams. And then we have a very few wild rainbow trout streams, really about 5, we have a few highlighted on here, but really it's about 5 or so streams in the Deerfield River Basin that have sort of viable, self-sustaining wild populations of rainbow trout. And rainbow trout are also not native to Massachusetts. They are native to North America, but they were brought over, roughly the same time as brown trout for, about the same reasons, to sort of prop up a declining native coldwater fishery. And they've since been stocked, all across the state for, years and years and years, but they've not caught on nearly as well as the brown trout. And there's, several reasons for that. They aren't as adapted to low pH systems that, we tend to have a lot of here in the Northeast. They're also adapted to, rain-dominated systems in the Pacific Northwest, which, we're sort of transitioning in that direction with climate change, but in general, we have more of snowy winters, not so much rain. And they're also adapted to not competing with, fall spawning brook trout and brown trout, which, hatch out and are ready to go before these guys even lay their eggs. So they have a bit of a head start to the detriment of wild rainbow trout. So We don't know a lot about these fisheries, because we haven't necessarily spent a ton of time looking specifically at them. But from what we do know is superficially, they look similar to our other small stream wild trout fisheries. So, generally short-lived, generally small fish. The vast majority of these fish in the tributaries are, less than 8 inches. But there are a lot of unknowns here, particularly because, rainbows are notorious for being highly migratory. So whether these fish just use the tributaries for spawning and rearing, and then, as they get, 2 or 3 years old, they move out to the main stem deer field and get bigger. We just don't know that. Something that we're interested in kind of looking at down the road, but there are a lot of unknowns right now. All right, so that's sort of a broad overview, kind of the first part of the presentation, talking about, status and distribution, current knowledge of what we know about our wild trout resource. And so I'm going to try to switch gears just a little bit and talk about, kind of how we use a wild trout stream classification system for, management purposes. And so, the first kind of cut in this is this very broad scale classification that we have in place, which is designating streams as cold water fish resources. So I'm sure you guys are familiar or have seen this term before, cold water fish resource, or the acronym CFR. Basically, that means that any stream that we go out and survey or have surveyed where there's evidence of a cold water fish, whether that's slimy sculpin, long-nosed sucker, or et cetera, any of these species here in the list. More pertinent to this discussion is, the 3 species of stream trout. But if we find evidence of any of these species in a stream or river, we can use that information to designate that stream as a CFR. And so it's really important to be designated as a CFR because these streams are then afforded additional protections. I'm not going to get into much detail here because it can sort of go in a whole other direction. But if you're interested, and there's certainly information online about all these different protections, the Water Management Act, water quality standards, stormwater standards, Riverfront Protection Act, Wetlands Protection Act, a number of different things that have wording in them to protect cold water fish resources. But we can sort of talk about that at another time if you're interested in that. Feel free to contact me or look things up online. There's a lot of information out there.
Adam, there's one question here. Do we have any healthy populations of sea-run brook trout in the Commonwealth?
Oh yeah, definitely. There certainly are, a number of healthy sea-run brook trout populations. There's some on Martha's Vineyard, Cape Cod, the southeastern part of the state. There's some sort of very marginal potential sea-run brook trout streams up on the North Shore, but not very many. They're mostly concentrated sort of, southeastern part of the state, Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard. But yeah, they're certainly there, and there's some very good ones.
And somebody else asked, does this include stocked fish?
No, so, none of these analyses that I'm talking about deal with stocked fish. Some of these streams are also stocked, but they sort of have wild fish and stocked fish. But, to be honest, of those, almost 1,300 wild trout streams that we have, we only stock about 12 or 13% of that total, depending on the year. And that number has been cut down quite a bit over the last few decades. So, roughly 90% of wild trout streams are not stocked. So some are, but most of them aren't. But for the purposes of this, I'm really concentrating on our wild trout populations and not our stock trout fisheries. Is that it for questions?
That's it for now.
Okay, thanks. All right, so the CFR designation is very important. It gives additional protections to cold water fisheries, but from a management perspective, from an angler perspective, it's not super useful because it treats sort of everything the same. It's either a CFR or it's not a CFR. So we were interested in making it more sort of wild trout specific, making this, this information we have, all this data we have, more useful and meaningful for anglers, making it more, pointed for conservation purposes, for targeting land acquisition, prioritizing management and things like that. And so the first step we took then was to take all of our available data for CFRs and find those that support wild trout. And it turns out that, over 99% of CFRs are also wild trout streams. So we didn't really narrow it down much in that regard. So we went on to the next step and started to, come up with a way to classify our wild trout streams into categories, into, different categories that we can then use for management and prioritization and things like that. So other agencies do this all across the country. A lot of states, categorize or classify their wild trout streams for management purposes, but they all use sort of different metrics. So there's really no consensus on, what to use to classify the streams, whether it's, biomass or abundance or something else. But looking at our data that we had, what we were interested in using as sort of a metric for management, and what we thought would be most useful and sort of easily interpreted was a simple abundance. So the number of trout per kilometer, and then based on our standard electrofishing survey data. And so this will hopefully make more sense in the next slide when I run through an example, but our classification was based on percentiles of number of trout per kilometer, but we pulled these out relative to the trout species present. So, we have streams with only brook trout, we have streams with only brown trout, we have streams with mixed populations. So we wanted to be able to compare, apples to apples, because, in some cases, brook trout on average are more abundant than brown trout. So we didn't want to compare brook trout to brown trout, if that makes sense. And then we also, pulled out the classification and based it on stream order, which in itself is another classification system. If you're not familiar with stream order, it's a system that allows you to sort of visualize, stream size and especially longitudinal position of a stream in the landscape. So what this means is if you think of a watershed and all the streams that drain the watershed to its outlet, if you go up into the headwaters and you see the small little streams with no tributaries of their own, these are first order streams. When two first order streams come together, they make a second order stream. When two second order streams come together, they make a third order stream, and so on and so forth. So it's a way to visualize, relative size, first order versus third order, and then longitudinal position in the landscape. So first order streams, headwater streams higher in the watershed, third, fourth, fifth order streams are sort of further downstream. So hopefully that makes sense. And so, this is just one example of how we developed this classification system. So we came up with 4 different percentile bins, A, B, C, and D, and tied these to number of trout per kilometer relative to the predominant trout species in the system and relative to stream order. So just, for an example here, so say we go out and do a fish survey on an unknown stream where we've never surveyed before. And we complete the survey, we see that we've only caught brook trout, well, as the only trout species present, okay? We look at the map, determine it's a second order stream, we count all the fish and extrapolate out to a kilometer and say we collected 750 brook trout per kilometer. So we can look at that second order stream, 750 brook trout, that would be a class B stream. And we can do this with any stream that we have or we've done or will do. And so it can fit into a bin. And I'll mention sort of what the importance of this is here in the next slide. But hopefully that makes sense to you. If it doesn't, feel free to ask for more clarification. We also have additional classes that aren't within the sort of neat categories. We may have missing data, we may have incomplete data, we may have unsurveyed streams. So these are all targeted for updated surveys to make them, complete and able to sort of put into the classification system.
Adam, I have another question,
Yeah.
a couple questions. What percentage of stock trout are caught? And can you use GPS tags to allow follow fry from stream to river?
So what proportion of stock trout are caught? That's
What percentage? Yeah, right.
yeah. So we don't know. That is a very difficult question to answer because what you need is like a very detailed creel survey. So you need to go out and interview anglers and understand, how many people are keeping and things like that. So that's a really a massive, massive undertaking. So we don't know. And it's difficult because, depending on where the water body is, depending on how many fish are stocked in that water body, whether it's a pond or a river or a stream, it's at this point it's almost impossible to answer. So it varies a lot, and I don't have a good answer for that. It's something I'd love to know, but we just don't have that sort of manpower at this point to be able to answer that question. And then the other piece was GPS tags. Well, GPS tags, I don't think they quite make those small enough at this point for the size of fish that we would be interested in tagging. And they're really expensive. We certainly could, use other methods. We could, fit them with pit tags, which are, passive integrated transponders, small-ish tags that get injected into the body cavity. And we do that in other systems, monitoring movement of the sea run brook trout in some of the streams down in the southeast and the Cape. We've done that, or we're going to be doing that on a big project that we've got coming up on the Swift River. And so, you can certainly do that, and you can put up it's called an array, and every time the fish with the tag goes past that array, it records it. So we know if it's going downstream or upstream and when it passes through. So that's one way of doing it. It doesn't allow us to track its every movement and where it goes at any moment, but it allows us to sort of see when it goes past a certain point. So yes, we could do that, but we haven't yet for at least for the rainbow trout. I'm assuming that's what you're asking.
All right, thank you. We have a number of questions here, but I think we're going to move on just in the interest of time, because a lot of these, yeah.
All right, so, one of the big things that we're interested in using this classification system for is to promote angling and inform anglers of these wild trout resources. So we've recently completed an angler survey. Some of the big takeaways, at least, from my perspective, is anglers don't generally fish small streams. And one of the major reasons for that is they don't know where to go. They don't have a lot of information on small streams. And we have a ton of small stream wild trout fisheries that, are underutilized. And so, being able to promote angling and inform anglers, beyond just a blanket map of CFRs, we can, put out there, there's this set of Class A wild trout streams in your area that you might want to try out or something like that. It's a big part of what we're trying to do. And then, I'll talk about this more on at the end of the next slide, but being able to prioritize streams and stream reaches for additional conservation or restoration actions, in short, additional management, is really going to be a big piece of the classification system, where we can actually drill down a bit. Instead of treating everything the same and managing all of our wild trout resources sort of in the same way with a blanket, but not, going the other direction and trying to look at each individual 1,277 streams and manage them individually. We can manage them as groups, as these sort of classification system allows. So, I'll talk about more of that here in just a second, but, really prioritizing management actions is going to be key for, moving forward under, this climate change that we're experiencing at the moment. So, I'm sure you've all heard this and you all sort of are familiar with some of the happenings that are going on with climate change and some of the issues that arise, particularly when it comes to cold water streams and cold water ecosystems. So it's already occurring and it's continuing to worsen. Higher temperatures, meaning high air temperatures, but that's also reflected in long-term groundwater temperatures as well as surface water temperatures. More rainfall, particularly over the winter, more severe storms in the summer, more frequent droughts, which seems counterintuitive if you have more rainfall, but it's sort of one extreme to the next. We've had, 3 major droughts in the past 6 or 7 years. So, we have much more extreme conditions and some of the negative effects of climate change, that are tied to these higher temperatures and rainfall and droughts are really exacerbated by human development, human infrastructure on the landscape. And I'll talk about this much more. I just wanted to bring it up here, but I'll talk about this more sort of kind of at the end of the presentation, but I at least wanted to bring it up at this point. And, having this classification system allows us to sort of prioritize management actions a little bit more than we could sort of looking at all of the streams individually or looking at all as the sort of the same type of resource. And so, whether we want to prioritize land acquisition, so say we find, a land that's available or alongside a Class A wild trout stream. So if it's a Class A wild trout stream, we can assume that it has, temperature, structure, habitat, water levels that are really conducive to supporting a high abundance of wild trout, meaning that likely in the future, it can be a place that offers, the conditions that will be a refuge for wild trout under, continued climate change. And so we might want to really prioritize our actions to acquire land along this stream and protect it, or acquire land in the watershed to the stream. Conversely, streams that may be marginal, sort of Class D streams, this lower end of the scale, we may want to prioritize for restoration activities to build resiliency into the system, replace culverts, take out dams, do habitat improvements to sort of prop up these streams to higher classification levels and to build resiliency into the system and allow these to become potential refuges down the line, whereas they might not be at this point. All right, so I'll talk a little bit more about climate change and some of the other sort of local conditions that and some of the actions that we can do to remedy some of that towards the end. But I just have a little bit more to get through here with respect to the Nashua River watershed and its wild trout resources. So you see here the watershed, everything in gray is a water body, whether lake, reservoir, river, stream, and everything in red, highlighted in red, is a wild trout stream. So there are 97 wild trout streams in the Nashua River watershed, which seems like a lot, but it's really a small proportion of all of the wild trout streams in the state. It's sort of on the eastern cusp of where we're starting to really get a high number of wild trout streams. Move further east and there's very few. Move further west and there starts to be a lot more. What is interesting though is that the Nashua River watershed has the easternmost of what we would consider sort of larger river trout fisheries in Massachusetts. So a large river trout fishery in Massachusetts really isn't that big, but places like the Squannacook, the Nissitissit, Squannacook are we would consider sort of larger river trout fisheries typical of Massachusetts. And if you go further east, we just don't have those. So it's an important recreational resource as well. If we break it down a little bit more and look at our classification system, there's 6 Class A wild trout streams in Massachusetts or in Nashua River watershed. Most of these are sort of small headwater streams, except for the Still River, which is actually a fairly sizable stream in some places. 10 Class B wild trout streams, including Sucker Brook and Gulf Brook, which we've been doing a lot of work on and will continue to be doing a lot of work on. They're interesting systems and are doing a lot of restoration work there. In Wiki Brook, which although it's Class B, I would consider it to be sort of one of the better wild trout streams in the state, really. Some of the abundance numbers are kind of skewed from surveys where we found not a lot of fish, but in general, it's a very good wild trout stream, and is a pretty unique place. 23.
Wiki in Sterling, Lancaster area, just to let people know.
Oh yeah. Also, done some restoration work on there. The dam recently, well, not recently, but within the last decade came out, which has been sort of a boon to that system as well. 23 Class C wild trout streams, including the aforementioned Squannacook River that you can see going into Nissitissit Reservoir down there. 47 Class D streams, including some of the marginal wild trout fisheries like Squannacook and Nissitissit. And then concerning 9 streams that have historic evidence of wild trout, but have since been resurveyed in the last 5, 10, 15 years and have not found any evidence of wild trout. And the most notable are sort of right in the middle there, Catacoonamug and Bow Brook, and there's a few others scattered around, but they used to have wild trout and we haven't been able to find any recently. That doesn't mean they're gone, but it does concern me that they've, sort of the abundance has dropped to the point where we can't find them in our regular surveys. So they may be hiding somewhere, but it's a little concerning that that's happening. So, why are there so many marginal trout fisheries? So, if we take the Class E and the sort of trout streams that have, quote unquote, disappeared, it's well over half of the wild trout fisheries in the Nashua River watershed are sort of at that lower scale. And one of the reasons are, like we have, in a lot of places in Massachusetts, especially sort of the eastern half of the state, dams are ubiquitous. So there are 81 dams on wild trout streams alone in the Nashua River watershed. 38 of, over a third of the wild trout streams in the watershed have dams, and most of them have multiple dams. That's really a huge issue, that probably leads to a lot of the marginalization of some of these streams. The other thing is a lot of roads. So when we put the roads layer on this map, you almost can't see the wild trout streams anymore because there's so many roads. And, it's not just the roads themselves, although they can be very problematic when we talk about, road crossings with, undersized or perched culverts, runoff, sediment running off of roads, which is very problematic for benthic habitat, salt running off of roads, stormwater runoff draining from roads, bringing warm water in summer storms, or, just leading to really flashy flow regimes in places with a lot of impervious cover. But in addition to the roads, it's, what's associated with roads, that's infrastructure and development. So roads are leading to shopping centers with parking lots. Roads are leading to houses and housing developments. They're leading to, golf courses. They're leading to other developments, things that, have a lot of impervious surfaces, these things with a lot of stormwater infrastructure, which, as I mentioned, that, a lot of runoff for sediment, other pollutants, superheated precipitation that comes off of, black pavement during the summer and goes straight into cold water streams. A lot of real issues with, roads and development. And so that's the other sort of main concern. But these aren't, dams and roads aren't something that's unique to the Nashua River watershed. It's sort of common throughout most of the brook trout's range, especially in sort of highly developed places like Massachusetts. But, there's a lot of things that we can do to kind of, work on remedying some of this. Dealing with climate change, we can all sort of do our part with that, but any substantive change with climate change is going to sort of, have to, in a lot of cases, come from the top down, international, national sort of actions that are going to curb, continuing climate change, are going to be sort of, out of a lot of individual hands, but there are things that we can do on a local level, on an individual level, to help coldwater fisheries and wild trout. So, one of those things that we've been working on a lot, with a lot of partnerships, including, watershed associations, Massachusetts DER, other conservation organizations like Trout Unlimited, people like that, are dam removal. So dams have been coming out, they continue to come out. It's something that can be done at the local level. There's a lot of funding for dam removals. And so that's one big piece, taking dams out, restoring connectivity, taking out that heat sink, allowing that stream to recover. Working on culvert upgrades is another important one, especially perched culverts, undersized culverts that don't allow fish passage, widening those or making it so they're bridges or open bottom culverts, allowing connectivity is going to be important, in the future to allow, cold water fish to access cold water refuges that they may be cut off from at the moment. And then limiting development, especially development in riparian zones and floodplains, especially in areas that, small streams, medium-sized streams that really rely on shading to keep them cooler. Managing stormwater is a real important one as well. I know there's stormwater standards in a lot of places, but there's always more that can be done, particularly in new developments, to manage stormwater runoff, and retaining vegetated riparian areas. And then, limiting water use. I'm not exactly sure where people generally get water in the towns in the Nashua River watershed, but there are a lot of places where, municipal water and private wells are dug into groundwater, that groundwater resources in subwatersheds with cold water fisheries. And, as that water table is drawn down, when water is taken out of these wells, at some point it gets to the point where it no longer is intercepted by the stream channel, and you really lose the major component of, keeping that stream channel, the water in the stream channel, cold enough for trout and other cold water fish. So limiting water use in places that have groundwater wells, particularly during droughts, and not really watering your lawn all the time, or washing your car or things like that, sort of non-essential water use. So that's, these are all things that we can really do on a local level, or even individual level, to help remedy the effects of past development or current development, and in conjunction with climate change. So that's actually all I've got for now. If you guys have questions, feel free to ask. If you have questions down the road, send me an email. I do have my phone number on here. You'll have to leave a voicemail. I'm not in the office all the time, but I do check my voicemails, but it may just be easier to email. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was a great overview of our fisheries and our watershed and around the state. There are a number of questions that we have here. I think we have 18. So I'll just kind of skip down to some of these. Somebody asked if there's hybrid trout in any of the streams. Is that a thing?
It is, yeah. So, brook trout and brown trout are closely enough related that they can hybridize. It's very rare, but we do see it every once in a while. We'll get an angler will send us a picture that they caught. It's called a tiger trout, a brook and brown mix. Occasionally we'll see that. Like very rarely do we see it in our surveys. So it's just, there's not that many, but it does happen.
Okay. Is the class information, the ABCD for certain streams in the Commonwealth, available to the public or just for fisheries managers? Is it something you can find online?
At this point, it's not available to the public. We're still working on how we want to make that available. I mean, it's not going to be a secret. So certainly it will be available. We're just trying to find the best way to put it out, the most useful way to put it out. But yeah, at some point it'll be something that will be available.
Okay, great. So one of our board members, Ralph Baker, asked, do you have a sense of how many of the trout in a typical stream are caught at least once by anglers?
Yeah, that's another very difficult question because angling effort is so patchy. Some streams likely get fished once a decade. Some streams get fished constantly. So it'd be very, very difficult to put a number on that. So yeah, I'm sorry. We just don't know. It's a good question, but it's a very difficult one to answer.
Okay, thanks. Do stocked trout eventually become wild and start to reproduce after a few years? It sounds like maybe they do, like in the case of those rainbow trout, maybe, or
Yeah, so there's always the chance that stock trout will reproduce, but the vast majority of them don't make it past sort of late summer. They're stocked in the spring. They don't make it very long. They're generally not all that well equipped to survive in the wild. That being said, obviously at some point they've reproduced to the point where they've established populations of both brown trout and rainbow trout, but that is, likely because they've, been stocked for 150 years. If you extrapolate it out from 150 years, if there's a fish here and there that succeeds and reproduces, it's going to happen. But on any given year, it's highly unlikely that a stock trout's going to survive and then have the wherewithal to find, the energy and resources to reproduce. But there's also, the fact that, these early stockings of trout, back in the, 1800s, early 1900s were essentially, one step removed from wild fish. So they were, eggs from kind of the first generation after a wild fish. So they still had the genetics to, survive in the wild. The fish that we stock now have been hatchery strained fish for, decades, if not, 50, 60, 70 years. So they're, like putting a chicken in the woods. They don't really know what to do. So
sure, understood. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So our own watershed scientist, Jessica Vasey Powell, has asked, do you find that stream size is associated with fish size? I can't remember if you said so. If so, would directing anglers towards smaller Class A streams have anglers selectively targeting young fish?
So, I mean, to some degree, larger streams, have on average some larger fish, but the smaller streams, brook trout are kind of confined to the smaller streams for the most part anyway, because that's where the water temperature that they need is available. So most of brook trout streams are small anyway. Even if they're second order or third order streams, they tend to be on the smaller scale. And they all have roughly similar sized fish. So, I don't think that they would necessarily anglers would be targeting younger fish at these smaller streams. They really only live about 2 or 3 years regardless, whether it's in a first order stream or a third order stream. They may be slightly bigger at 3 years old in a third order stream than they are in a first order stream, but they aren't, substantially different as far as age structure.
So just related to an earlier question, what would you classify the Squannacook or the Nissitissit as in terms of order?
So I think the parts of the Squannacook are 4th order and parts of them are 5th order. And I think the Nissitissit is the same. I'd have to look back. I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's certainly larger order rivers. They're 4th.
Right. That's what I sort of put it in that category anyway. Whereas somebody asked about up in the Willard Brook State Forest and areas up there, Trap Fall Brook would maybe be a second order stream.
Yeah.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right,
you
thank
can,
you.
I mean, this is something you can look at. I mean, if you're interested, it might not be that
Yep.
exciting, but if you just look at a map and you count all the tributaries, you can sort of see which order a stream is.
Right, right,
But, the only thing is that a first and a second don't make a third. It has to be 2 seconds that make a third, so.
right, right, okay. This next question relates to some of the work that Al Futterman's doing. It's about the type of vegetation management you do to build stream resiliency. We're doing a landscape redesign project where we're planting a lot of bushes and native plants along streams to give them resiliency to flooding, and also shade the stream and things like that. So can you talk a little bit about what you do to manage to build stream resiliency?
Yeah, so that I'm not super familiar with. We, at least fisheries, we don't do a lot with that type of habitat work,
That'd
plantings
be
and things like
DER,
that.
Division of Ecological Restoration.
Yeah, so yeah,
Right.
we don't do much with that. It's certainly, just from a habitat perspective, that is very helpful. Being able to have the shade along these rivers or streams and having native vegetation, especially in sort of small streams with canopy cover, most of their food resources actually come from the terrestrial environment. Whether it's terrestrial invertebrates coming in, which is a direct food resource, or leaves and other sort of resources that fall and sort of feed the base of the food chain. It's really important to have sort of that canopy in forested systems for sure.
Right. Okay. Maybe you could stop sharing your screen for now, and then we can
Oh yeah,
see you
sorry.
better. That's right. I forgot to ask you that, so thanks. So another question from Jessica: could you comment on the interactions between trout stream class and CFRs, cold-water fish resource streams, that aren't currently meeting cold water targets? For example, the stream is designated a CFR, but it has temperatures more in line with warm water fishery. Are any of these classed high in this new scheme?
Yeah, so we don't. I mean, DEP uses a temperature sort of requirement when they designate a stream as a CFR. Our designation is a little bit different. So we only use biological data. We do take stream temperatures and things like that, but in the absence of a temperature logger, a one stream temperature measurement is not all that meaningful. And so you guys, I know, are doing some temperature loggers, and which is great and very helpful. But we don't have sort of blanket temperature logger data. So we don't have a lot of that information, but we use biological data, and we are assuming that when we're doing our surveys, generally during the height of the summer, if we're finding cold water fish, that is indicative of water cold enough to allow them to be there, or allow them to choose to be there. So we don't really have a component of temperature in our designation, and so it's not really a question I can necessarily answer, but I can sort of anecdotally, there are certainly streams that taking a temperature on the day that we do a survey sort of are higher than you would expect, but we still find trout. And that means that really the temperature is very patchy. So if we take a temperature reading here, 10 feet away, there could be an upwelling where all the trout are, which is a much different temperature. So it's a sort of a hard question to answer. It's a very patchy resource in some places, but we do find that places that have sort of consistently cold water, sort of, it's not so patchily distributed. Especially some of the more groundwater fed systems down in the southeast and the Cape, especially the tailwater that comes out of Quabbin Reservoir, Swift River tailwater, which is 55 degrees every day year round. These are the kind of places where we find, much sort of larger fish, because they aren't dealing with these, small areas of cold water pockets where they're sort of crammed in. They don't have to, deal with the strains and the stresses of finding these places, or being stuck in these areas, and they're able to feed and grow much more efficiently. So that's sort of a long-winded non-answer, but yeah, that's it's sort of a hard question to answer.
Right. So that's what we were looking at with our logger work, trying to find the refugia. Where would they go as the temperature rises and a few degrees over the next decades? Where would these fish hang out? And are there where are the groundwater upwellings and things like that?
Yeah,
So.
and those can change too, especially as if there are groundwater wells that are pulling the groundwater out, you can lose some of that pressure and you have less upwelling, or sedimentation can cement some of the benthic habitat and prevent some of that weaker upwelling from coming through.
Right. Yep. Thank you. Let's see. Does Mass Wildlife keep a public list of priority dams to remove, like the DER does?
We don't have a formal list. We have sort of, lists of places that we'd like to have dams removed. We've been working with DER on a lot of this, but it's one of those things that we know which ones we want, and when someone reaches out and asks, we're like, yes, that's a good one, because we don't often pursue dam removals ourselves. It usually comes from DER or a nonprofit that is interested in taking a dam out, and then we'll work with them on consulting and monitoring and things like that. Unless it's on our property, sometimes if it's on a wildlife management area or something like that, we'll sort of take the lead on that. But it's generally we're more of an advisory role when it comes to that.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We have a question from Marion Stoddard. She was asking, can you describe the special state legislation we have to protect the Squannacook and Nissitissit Rivers?
And the short answer is no. That's, as a biologist, like, I do know some of the sort of ins and outs of that, but there's so much of that stuff that I am not exposed to on sort of a day-to-day basis. So, without going and reading up on it, or following along with some of the legislative stuff, I don't necessarily get exposed to a lot of that every single day. So you may know more than me.
So they are designated as outstanding resource waters,
Okay.
both the Squannacook and Nissitissit, and of course they're both considered wild and scenic rivers now under the federal act. So I hope that's what you're talking about, Marion. So the Nissitissit is famous for river anglers. If it's a marginal class D, does that mean that anglers are mostly fishing for stocked fish there, and or not?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's mostly stocked fish. There are the occasional wild fish pops up in our surveys on the main stem, but most of the wild fish in those systems are in the tributaries. They'll move into the main stem, particularly during the winter, but most of the time, you're catching stocked fish, with the occasional wild fish.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So another question: what priorities and research does Mass Wildlife have for fish as food for other wildlife, not just human anglers?
Yeah, so we don't have any, of our own research on that topic. It is obviously well known that fish are, eaten by a number of different, otters, herons, eagles, ospreys, even occasionally raccoons, some smaller fish, maybe by, snakes and turtles and things like that. But, we don't have any of our own research. It's likely that quite a few fish get eaten. Probably a lot more fish get eaten by other animals than are caught by anglers, just because, they're under pressure from predators, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, all over. But, it's a natural occurrence. It's not, it's highly unlikely that it's any sort of out of whack or anything like that. But yeah, we don't have our own research down that road.
Okay. This is somewhat related, like fish eating fish. So somebody's asking about, can you talk about the impact of the non-native trout, brown rainbow tiger, that Mass Wildlife stocks on the native brook trout population? Studies have shown that they prey on smaller brook trout and are limiting habitat available from the native brookies to adapt to the warmer climate.
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid point. And in some cases, it's true. That the thing is I think that the vast majority, and I mentioned it before, the vast majority of our wild trout streams, especially those brook trout streams, the smaller headwater streams and, small second and third order streams that are cold enough to support, abundances of brook trout, are generally not the ones that get stocked. We only stock, about 12% of the total of our wild trout streams. And most of those are sort of larger, more accessible. And so those places tend to have, more marginal wild brook trout fisheries anyway. But yeah, certainly it could be a concern. But big picture, I don't think it's a huge problem, at least, in most instances. But yeah, it's a valid concern in some cases. And we don't have information on how many, young of the year or juvenile brook trout stocked fish might eat. But, these fish are getting eaten by everything, including their own parents. So, putting 200 brown trout into a, wild brook trout stream, may not be ideal for these young of the year fish, but I don't think it is going to have a catastrophic impact on them. In some instances, maybe, but overall, I think that our stocking program is pretty cognizant of limiting that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we can tell the next question is from a trout fisherman. Charlie Shaden owns the Evening Sun Fly Shop in Pepperell. With the decline of mayflies, has it ever been considered to stock bugs in the form of eggs to get them a foothold in the stream?
Not that I know of, there's probably a reason why they're declining. So I think that sort of pinpointing why they're declining would be the first step in trying to remedy that, because, in similar to transplanting fish or reintroducing fish, if you don't, deal with the problem of why they disappeared in the first place, you're just going to keep dumping them in there, and they're not necessarily going to do anything. So, if they're and we don't do really any invertebrate research sort of in the fisheries department. There may be some academic stuff on this. I'm not familiar with the literature, but certainly, that's an option as long as you sort of are able to remedy the underlying causes first. But it's not something that we would necessarily undertake.
Right, I think the DEP is revamping their benthic macroinvertebrate sampling protocols, or we're hoping to get more involved, get more volunteers involved to do that kind of sampling. So eventually. So somebody asked, can fish adapt to warmer waters like we see birds doing?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, they can. And there's some research out there that they can adapt pretty quickly. I don't know how extreme that can be. I don't know if they could necessarily ever adapt, to 30-degree water, 30 degrees Celsius water. Is at least trout. There's sort of upper range at this point. Lethal range is in the low 20s, which is like 75 degrees or something. Generally, we don't like to see the water over about 68 for any extended period of time, but certainly there's some wiggle room in there, and there's already been some evidence that they've been adapting a little bit to increased water temperatures, but I don't know if they can necessarily keep up with how fast things are changing, but it's an avenue of research that people are certainly going down. Not our agency, we don't really do that type of research, but certainly other sort of federal agencies and academics are doing that research, and it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So somebody else asked, how are other cold water species doing? Are trout generally a good indicator species for the entire cold water assemblage?
Yeah, they are. I mean, they're easily the most widely distributed, especially brook trout. And in our cold water streams, especially our smaller cold water streams, it's oftentimes only brook trout, and no other fish species. They're a great indicator of cold water habitat. So once they're kind of considered an indicator species, what have you want to call them, a canary type of species, that's fine. But yeah, they really are a good indicator. And I've spent a lot of time, kind of focusing on wild trout, but we certainly do not discount these other cold water fish. It's just they tend to be not highlighted as much because they're not, as charismatic as the brook trout. They're not as, well known as trout. They're not sort of a recreational species, but they are important as well, particularly some of the kind of more widely distributed cold water fish like slimy sculpin and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Peter Severance said that the Connecticut DEEP is in their 2022 conservation and management plan is taking steps to protect their wild brook trout populations from non-native trout. And then later on, he puts a link to that article that we can access. So he said he can send a PDF if you're interested.
Okay,
I know
yeah,
he's studying the Merrimack River. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think some of these other questions have already been answered. Let me see. One about when you talk about natural trout, is this a blanket statement that includes naturalized fish?
What do they mean by natural? I guess there's
Right.
quite a few terms out there. When I'm talking about wild trout, I'm talking about trout that have been born in the stream. Their parents may have been stocked fish at some point, so they're not necessarily what we would consider native wild fish, but any fish that was born in the stream is wild. A stocked fish, that was born in a hatchery and stocked in the river is not wild, even if it lives there for 5 years, which is highly unlikely. But if it, holds over for a few years, it's still not going to be a wild fish. It's still a stocked fish. If it has offspring that are then born in the stream, we could consider those wild fish.
Okay. And then Charlie Shaden is asking again, where can I get an answer on putting eggs in this bug eggs in the stream?
I don't know. I'm not sure where. If you want to send me an email, I could maybe forward it around to some people that work more with invertebrates, and see if they have an answer. But yeah, I don't know right now off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. I think we've gotten through most of the questions. It's about 8:10. I'm just going to share my screen again. Let's see, that's our one I wanted. Anyway, want to thank you very much, Adam, once again for a wonderful program.
Thank you.
Yes, there's a lot of great questions that came up, and I think if there are more questions, you can certainly send Adam an email, and He can get back to you if he's not in the field. He's going to be very busy, of course, coming up with the spring season. What concerns you more, warming temperatures or increased incidence of drought? That's
Oh
from
man,
one of our.
that's a tough one.
Yes.
You know, I don't know that I think they sort of go hand in hand. You know, and it depends on where you are. You know, the drought can have a real significant effect on sort of isolated populations. Well, I mean, I guess warming temperatures can too. You know, so that's a tough one.
Yeah.
You know, I would say they're equally concerning. You know, when you have an isolated population, if the stream dries up and they have nowhere to go, that's it for them. But also if the stream warms up, they have nowhere to go, and that's it. But the drought is sort of a, you know, shorter lived type of phenomenon. So, you know, we're not seeing kind of multi-year droughts here. We're seeing, you know, 6 months of drought, and then it's fine for a couple of years, and then we see 6 months of really intense drought. And so, you know, at that sort of level, if they have somewhere to go, they generally are able to rebound. But if the climate keeps warming and warming and warming, it may just push them to the point where they have nowhere to go at all, ever. So we'll see. They're both equally concerning, but there are things we can do about it. So.
Right. And I want to say, going back to the debris in streams, the woody material that we have in streams is really important. You had mentioned that before. I know people who are paddlers like to see that those materials come out, you know, so they can easily paddle down the Squannacook or Nissitissit, but they are really important for those streams, that the trees, the branches, that for a lot of different reasons, the hydrology.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, they're one of the major habitat producer. You know, they're habitat in themselves, but they also, you know, shape the flow to create, you know, create more habitat, pools, undercuts, things like that. So yeah, they're really important.
Well, once again, thank you very much.